Hey there, we're going to walk you through how to use Xcode to build your iPhone, Mac OS, iPad OS, Apple TV, and Apple Watch apps. It's a really powerful tool. It's the main development environment you're going to use when you're building apps for the Apple ecosystem. And we're going to show you a few of the kind of fun features and really useful tools that are built right into the tool itself. So let's take a look. Let's build an app. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is we need to go get Xcode. Now, obviously I have it here, but where you're going to go is go off to the App Store. We'll just have a quick search for Xcode, hit return, and it'll probably be your first result. It's the IDE which stands for Integrated Development Environment for developing iOS and Mac apps. And for this version, for this video, we're going to be using Xcode 11.5, and we're going to be using macOS Catalina 10.15.5. So go download that. It's a free download. It might take a little while. It's gigabytes of data. And while you're waiting for that to download, maybe pause, go off, grab your cup of tea, because when we come back, what we're going to do is open up Xcode. So the very first thing we'll see is our little welcome screen. We get to choose whether we're going to start with a playground or a new Xcode project. We're going to pick new Xcode project. If you're following along with the app development with Swift curriculum, you'll be using a lot of Xcode playgrounds to just try out the Swift programming language. So if we choose to create a new Xcode project here, we have a selection of templates we can pick from. So we could pick, these are all the iOS ones you can see from this tab bar here that we can pick. We could pick watchOS templates to choose from, tvOS, macOS, cross-platform. We can build terminal apps to run, so they'll run from the command line. We can build games, augmented reality. I love showing this to my students because they get very excited about all the different types of projects they could be working on. What we're going to do is we're going to pick single view app here and hit next. Now it's time for us to give it a project name. So we're going to call this one the Code Hub Demo. I'm calling that because that's the group that I work with. Now for an organization identifier, this is just a way to uniquely identify your organization. You could use com.example. It uses reverse DNS. So typically the domain top level domain suffix comes first. You could use com.example. I'm going to use ie.thecodehub. And you can see that my bundle identifier, which needs to be unique for each app that I create, is going to be a concatenation of the organization identifier and the product name. I'm going to pick the language Swift. We could also pick Objective-C. And I'm going to pick the user interface storyboard. If you're following along with the Stanford course, you could pick Swift UI, but we're gonna stick with storyboard for this particular walkthrough. And we're going to include unit tests for kicks. There's some other testing capabilities built into Xcode that we can explore in later sessions, but we'll just leave unit tests for now, because maybe we'll explore that a little bit later in this session. So we'll hit the next button. Now it's going to ask us to save this somewhere. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to tap on my home directory, and I'm going to create a new folder in here called projects. You might call it developer. I tend to call my projects directory projects. And I'm going to save that there. I'm going to leave this checked. We won't go into this in this particular session, this create git repository on my Mac. There's some features built into Xcode that take advantage of when you have a source control management turned on in your application. So I tend to leave it on. So let's hit create. And now we're in here. So we have a little error message here popping up saying no author information was supplied by the version control system. It's handily giving me a fix button there. So I can hit fix and it'll open up the preferences for me. So I can just put my name in there. All right, cool. So I've filled out my preferences. So now But the version control piece, I'll get rid of that complaint. So let's get familiar with the Xcode interface. So let's see, this section over here is called the Navigator space. This gives us access to our project files. It gives us access to source control messages. It gives us access to the find bar. So this very first one, you can see this tab bar here. This tab bar here, it'll show the project navigator. If we tap on the first one, this is for our source control. The other one we'll look at today is the find. So if we need to find any items in here, if we search for maybe view did load and hit return, we can see it brings up a couple of results for us and it'll jump us to that file. If I tap back on the first one, this is where we'll spend most of our time in this particular session. And in fact, most of the time you're doing development. This is where you navigate your source files, your storyboard files, which is your user interface, your test files, and everything. So if we tap here on this blue, the Code Hub demo, this is called the project file. And over here, this is the editor pane. So what we have here is this is where we can define, we see things like the bundle identifier that we picked when we created the app, the version number and the build number, what devices we want this to run on, and what OS we want to require for those devices. We can pick the main interface. So this gives you choices from storyboards that are in your project. So you see we have a launch screen.storyboard and a main.storyboard file. We can say which device orientations we're going to support. Maybe we don't support landscape, or maybe we don't support portrait, depending on our type of app. There are a few things you can configure here. When we get a little bit fancier, and we want to add other capabilities, we would go to the Signing and Capabilities tab bar and tap on the plus button next to capability. And this is where we can add things like Apple Pay support, Game Center support, iCloud support, and a whole slew of other options. So this is where we would edit our project when we're actually getting ready to build this and ship it as a product on the App Store. And you can see here we have a message about we don't have signing enabled because I haven't picked a team yet. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to tap on one of these Swift files. Now, if you've taken the Everyone Can Code Puzzles courses or you've done other work with Swift, you'll recognize these files. This is just a class, and it's a Swift file because of our Swift suffix here. Now, when you're teaching this in Xcode, it's very useful, especially if it's up on a big screen at the front of a classroom, to change your font and color. So if we go to Xcode and pick Preferences, then we go to the Fonts and Colors tab, we have a few different choices, and they make it pretty easy for you. So I'm working in dark mode here. I could change this to Presentation Dark Mode or Presentation Large Dark Mode. And this makes it way easier to see from the back of the room when I'm actually coding. So I'm going to hit Command, comma to bring up preferences again. I'm actually going to change it back because we're doing this on video, so you should be able to see this. We'll go back to our normal view. So here's our Swift file in the editor pane. This piece here, this whole piece here, this is the editor pane. And it's where we're going to work with our source code files or our user interface files. Now, the nice thing about Xcode and the editor mode in particular is that we have things like autocomplete. So if I start typing in fun, it'll give me a few different options for autocompleting. In fact, a lot of different options. If I pick function statement, because that's the thing I want to do, I'm actually trying to create a function here, and I hit return, it's going to fill in a few default parameters for me. So the name, I can name my function, call it maybe press button. We can give it parameters, or we can delete those to say nope, no parameters. We can delete the return type if we don't have anything in there. Maybe this is actually just we'll rename this to say hello, because that's all we're going to do with this particular function. But you can see we get lots of help from Xcode as we're working through our code here. In fact, when I was typing in print, it started to autocomplete for me. I could pick a few different options. So that's the Swift editor in Xcode. But if I change to a main.storyboard, we'll see that the editor view here changes to suit the type of file that we're working with. This is the interface builder view. So this view is going to help us and let us design our app's interface. Now you can see here that I've got this big white square. If I actually pinch out with 2 fingers, I can see that it's giving me a view onto a simulation of the iPhone. And you can see down here, I can actually change that. So right now I'm viewing it as an iPhone 11. I can go tap on this here, and it'll bring up a little bar at the bottom. And I can pick an iPad Pro. I can pick an iPhone 8 Plus. Maybe I want to go way back old school and do an iPhone 4S. Let's pick the iPhone SE 2nd generation. We can pick the different interface styles, so maybe light mode or dark mode, and then the different orientations as well. Now, another piece of the interface that we haven't talked about yet, so this is the editor pane when we're looking at a storyboard file. Over here is the utility pane, and it's very useful, especially when we're in the interface builder mode, which is this mode here. So there are some options over here to inspect the identity of whatever we have selected. Now I don't have anything selected, so that's why it's saying not applicable. We can look at the attributes, we can look at the size, we can look at the connections for items, and these are all specific to whatever element we have selected. So let's see what that happens when we add an element to our screen. So we're going to add a button to our screen now. So the way we add a button is we go up to this plus button here in the toolbar, and we tap on that. And you can see that I have a whole list of objects that I can add to my view. And the nice thing is, because there are so many, we start typing in the search bar at the top and it'll narrow down our options. We can also tap and drag. So I'm going to drag my button out onto the screen. We're actually going to pin it down to the bottom. You can see these blue lines appear. They're guides to help me lay out my interface, because we don't want our button smashed right up against the side. So there's our button down in the corner. And you can see that this is opened up over here. This is what's called our view hierarchy. So we have the whole scene, which is the entire interface builder file right now. We can tap on view controller, is going to actually be our connection over to this view controller.swift file. We have a view inside that. We have this thing called the safe area. This is kind of handy, especially when we're dealing with phones with notches in them, to know where we can draw elements on the screen so that they don't get covered by any other elements. And you can see my button showed up. And when I tap on the button over here in the view hierarchy, it gets selected on the screen. Over in my utilities pane over here, I can see all the connections that are available to me. I can see the different size attributes I can set. If I tap on the attributes one, I have a whole bunch of different options for how to configure my button. I can change the text color, the shadow color, the font. There's a lot of different options there. And I can look at the identity inspector here. And I can see that this is giving me a class or a button of type UI button. That's the class that's backing this particular UI element. And we can set some accessibility details. So let's have a look. In the preview mode, we're going to rotate our phone a little bit. Oh, and you can see that I've already lost my button. My button's down here, and it didn't stick to my interface. So let's change the orientation back so I can see my button again. Now this preview mode down here is great for diagnosing issues very quickly with your user interface. So we're going to touch on it very briefly. And if you've read through the app development with Swift book, you've already seen the chapter on auto layout and stack views. What we're going to do is we're going to use a little auto layout magic here to lay out our button. So with our button selected, we have our view as option. We have our buttons here that can zoom in and zoom out of the user interface, as well as pinching. Then we have these buttons down here. So these help us do auto layout. So what we're going to do is we're going to add some new constraints. So we're going to pin this to the bottom and to the left-hand side. So we'll say, all right, cool, it'll be 16 pixels from the left, it'll be 20 pixels from the bottom. And we're going to constrain the width and the height. Now at the bottom, once we've selected all of those, we have this option to add 4 constraints. So we're going to do that. You can see these blue auto layout lines have showed up. And when we tap on them, they highlight them over here in the view hierarchy. You can see the height and width constraints are actually on the UI button, whereas these other constraints are constraints to the view above. And they're aligned to the bottom of the safe area, and the leading property of the button is aligned to this safe area. So let's try it now. Let's try moving. Let's try previewing our interface now. So now if we change orientation, our button is always showing up on the screen. It's always pinned to that bottom left-hand corner. That's way better already. So let's try checking this out. So this is our preview mode. Now let's actually build and run this app and see what we have. So up here we have the target that we're building, which is our app. And over here is the device or simulator that we're going to choose to run it on. So I'm going to choose to run on the iPhone SE 2nd generation. And if I hit this play button, it's going to build and run my application. And we can see the status here of the current build operation or launch operation. And there's the simulator launching. You can see it's in the full Chrome of the phone. And it's launching the app. And okay, there we go. There's our button, there's our app. Not very exciting yet. We can press on the button. It doesn't do anything because we haven't wired it up to anything. But this is a good start. Now we have our application. We can hit the home button to go back to the home screen. We can see our app there on the desktop and launch it again. But this isn't very exciting. Let's make it more exciting. Let's hook up this button now. So we're going to go back to Xcode just by tapping on it. Now, we have to connect this button to our code somehow. And I said that this view controller is connected to this view controller.swift. It's not magic. The way it's done is if you tap on the view controller here in the view hierarchy, and you go over to the utilities pane, you can show the identity inspector, and you'll see that it's of type view controller for the class. So what that means is it's going to look for, when it goes to instantiate this view, it's going to look for a view controller class to back it. Now the way to hook up this button to my code, because right now I don't have anything here that references a button or anything. If I tap on my main.storyboard again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up the assistant editor. So if we go up to the editor menu, there's an assistant option here. I'm going to tap on that. And now I have my interface builder view kind of squashed and some code over here. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to hide this utility pane. And the way I can do that is up here in the toolbar, there are these three options here, these three buttons. This will hide the inspectors, this will hide the navigator, and this will show and hide the debug console down at the bottom that we'll also get into a little bit later. So now what we're going to do, now we have a little bit more space. We have our button here that I'm going to tap on. The way I connect it to my code is by holding down the control key and clicking on my button and then dragging over to my source file. You can see that blue line pops out, and when I'm inside my class, it gives me a little hint text saying insert action outlet or outlet collection. So when we release down here, and I like to keep my actions down here, what we're going to do is create an action for this button. We could create an outlet or an outlet connection, but what we want to do is have some action be called when a user presses on the button. We're going to call it press button. We can have it, the message come from of type any, but let's make it sure that only UI buttons can send us this message. This next option here is touch up inside. This is the type of event that we're going to get a message on. This makes sure that the user has touched down on the button and then touched up inside the bounds of the button. And then these are the things that we can send as parameters. We could have no parameters sent. We could have the sender sent, so it'll actually send me this button when it sends that message. Let's hit connect and see what we have here. So this looks just like a function that we've written in some of our other examples in app development Swift, in Everyone Can Code Puzzles. We have this funky @IBAction directive that basically tells Interface Builder that this is an action that you can hook interface elements up to. We have our func keyword that we've seen before. We have our function name. We have our parameters here, including our local parameter names. Then we have the type of parameter that we're sending. And then we have our function body here. So let's print out a statement in here. That just says button pressed when someone presses on that button. So now let's build and run this. There's a stop button here. We can actually stop the running app. Let's just build and run it because it will automatically stop it. We'll say, yep, we want to stop that. The app is up and running again. Now, if I press this button now, you can see the console pops up. And if we drag the simulator around, we can see that we got a message saying button pressed. And every time I press the button, we get another message. Great, so this is a little more exciting than our previous demo. This is pretty good. If you're brand new to Xcode and brand new to coding, this is a fine place to stop because we've actually done a lot. We've built a user interface that we could hand to somebody and they could press that button and it'll be working. Now, it won't be very exciting because it'll just be sending messages down here to the log that they won't see. So maybe let's make this app a little bit more interesting. Let's add another wrinkle to it. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to Xcode. And leaving open the assistant editor, because we're going to need this in a second, we're going to add another element to the screen here. We're going to add just a plain view that we're going to color. So if I hit the plus button up here, and I'm going to type in view, actually what's going to happen is I'm selected here. This is why we had a slightly different set of options here. We had other snippets here. So this is stuff that'll automatically, if we tap on any of these, we can see what the snippet looks like. This is a nice handy shortcut way to add in code without having to type it all out. So if I tap on the storyboard file and hit the plus button, now I'm going to get my objects back. So I'm going to get my view elements back. Now the thing I want to add is a view. Now there are lots of views, but the one I want to add is just called just view. So I'm going to drag this out to the screen. Again, those guides come up to help me place it. I'm going to drag it. I want it to extend across the whole of the screen nearly. Now again, we're going to run into that same issue that we did before with the button. If we change our orientation, this isn't going to fill the screen anymore. So let's set some auto layout constraints on this. Now I actually can't see my auto layout options. So what I have to do is I have to close my assistant editor. So I'm going to go up here to the X and close this editor. And now to pin this to the sides, I'm going to add some new constraints. I want it pinned to the top. I want it pinned to the left and to the right side. Now, because I've defined the top and the two sides, I don't have to define the width because it will just stretch for me, but I do need to define the height. So let's define the height as 127. That works for me. We want to add these 4 constraints. Now it's also not very exciting to have a just plain white view because we can't actually see it. So let's tap on this button to bring back the inspector. And now I have my view selected. And if I lost it, it would be very hard to find this again. I can either tap in the general area or I can go over to my view hierarchy and tap on my view. Now I'm going to choose the attributes inspector. So you can see that this is different than the one that we saw for the button, the UI button attributes. Our view has slightly different options. So I can choose different colors for my background. I can choose the alpha, so I can make this a bit transparent if I wanted. Let's change the background color to something, maybe green, the system green color. Okay. Let's try changing the orientation. All right, that looks good. That kind of behaves the way we want it to behave. Now, when the user presses the button, we want to change the color of that view. So if we pull back up our assistant editor, in here, what we want to do is change the background color of that view. But right now, we don't have a way to refer to that view. So we can do that by creating a thing called an outlet. So again, just like we did with button, I have my view selected. I'm going to hold down the control key and drag out over here to my class. I like to keep outlets near the top of the file because they're basically just properties. When I let go, Xcode makes a pretty good guess that I want to create an outlet and not have an action performed from this view. I have to give it a name, so I'm going to call it color view. It's going to be of type UI view. And then we have this weak reference. We'll ignore that for now. If we connect, it creates again, we see another @IBOutlet directive. So this is telling Xcode, an interface builder, that, hey, I have these things available for you that you can connect inside my view controller class. Weak just refers to how it's stored in memory. We'll get into that in a much later session. But then this looks very similar. This part here looks very similar to other things that we've created where we've had properties on a class. So we have a variable called color view. We've defined the type as a UI view. And then we have this thing. If you've read the chapter about optionals in app development with Swift, you understand that that means that we're promising that there is going to be something connected there. But we can get into optionals in a little later date. Just know that when we're creating our IB outlets, we're typically going to use that exclamation point. Now, if I go, I don't need to drag these things over there. I can actually create my own IB outlets by typing in IB outlet. It'll give me an autocomplete. I could do weak var. Now I don't have this hooked up to anything yet, so I'll do UI view. Now you'll see that the difference between these two is that this one is filled in, this circle, and this circle is not, because it's not connected to anything. If I press that plus button, I can actually drag out and connect it to views. I didn't need to hold down control or anything. But this lets you know at a quick glance which items in your code are actually connected to something in the user interface. All right, so we're going to delete that line. And now what we're going to do down in the press button function, we're going to get rid of that log. And now we can refer to our color view by doing self.colorView like we would with any other property. We can use dot notation to access the background color. And this is nice. As I've started typing, just like in Swift Playgrounds, we get some autocomplete values here. So I'll hit background color. And then I'm going to assign that to a color. And because Swift knows that the background color is going to be of type UI color, I can actually just hit the dot, and then it'll give me an autocomplete of all these other colors here. So when we tap on this button, we're going to change the background color to blue. This is the same as if I'd written this. UI color.blue. So this is looking good so far. Let's try building and running this and see if this is all hooked up right. We're going to hit the play button. We're going to stop the running version. You'll note that it cleared my console of the messages from the last time I ran the app. But now if I press the button, we can see that it turned my view blue. So cool, we've done it. This is maybe not the most exciting app, but it's pretty good, pretty good. The problem with this is now that if we press the button, it stays blue. I'm not 100% sure anything's actually going on here. So there's a way for us to find out if our code is actually getting run, because maybe I'm running this code and trying to test it out and saying, oh, you know what, I don't know if I hooked it up right. So what I would do there is I would use what's called a breakpoint. So I can actually go over here to the gutter near where our dots are for our connections to the interface and tap in the side, and it'll drop this little blue mark. And what that is it's just what's called a breakpoint. So when my code gets to this execution point, it'll actually stop. And down here, this console is handy for seeing printed out messages, but it's also handy for debugging our application. And let me show you what I mean by that. So I've added the breakpoint, and I actually don't even need to restart my app. This is still running from before. If I press my button now, you can see everything pauses. I have a new view over here. My project navigator has snapped back out. It's gone to this option, which is the debug navigator. And this is only interesting when our app is actually running. It can show how much CPU we're using, how much memory we're using, network requests, and then I can see my call stack here. And then I can also see the items are in memory right now. So I can see that I have a reference to self here. I have my color view. So I can see that it's actually getting called, my code, because it's stopping here. But I'm just changing it to the same old color every time. So maybe what I want to do is, just for kicks, and I'm not saying this is going to be the nicest code, we'll add a new property in here that we're going to switch. It's going to be a variable. And we're going to call it isBlue. And to start off with, since we set it to green, we're going to set it to false. And now inside my press button function, we'll just do a little check. We'll say if, and I can pick my if statement autocomplete and ask for my condition. So we'll ask, and if it's blue, we're going to set the self.colorView background color to green. And in fact, we'll use system green because that's what we used in interface builder. And if otherwise, we will set it to blue. We'll leave our breakpoint down here. The really nice thing, actually, we're going to move our breakpoint up here where we check our condition. And we're going to run our app again. So that'll stop the current running version of the app. I haven't hit my breakpoint yet because I didn't pause. If I press my button, it's going to come in here. I can see that I've got some additional items. I've got my isBlue property there. I can use these buttons over here to control the flow of my code execution. So I can step over, I can continue, which would just run the code. I wouldn't be able to inspect it. But if I use this button, I can actually step from line to line. So I can see that we evaluated that to false. So we jumped into the else block. We can use this step into and step out of. Now this is gone because I have a reference to color view. It's jumped up here for me. And if I step over again, I could resume back down here. If I step over again, I'm reaching the end of that particular block of code. And then I can hit resume and it's changed it to blue. If I hit the button again, I'll pause again. Now, if I've tested out where my code is executing and I don't want this stopping for me anymore, I can actually just tap on this blue mark again and it'll disable that breakpoint. I can also hold down Command Y and it will disable all breakpoints in my entire project, so it won't stop for anything anymore. If I go back to the simulator, actually first I have to resume. It's not working. Why isn't it working? What would I have to check again? Well, I'd probably want to turn these guys back on. So I'll hit Command Y to enable breakpoints. I would tap on the button and say, okay, isBlue? isBlue is false. You know what? I never actually change it anywhere. Okay, well, let's handle that. So we would self isBlue equals false there, and it'll equal true here. Okay, now let's try running it. Now, if I resume this running of the code, it's not going to fix my problem because when I step through, I'm not stepping through this line because this is something I just added. I would have to restart the application. Here we go. We've restarted. We're going to press the button. We check to see if it's blue. It's false. We're going to continue. Okay, now it's blue. If I press the button again, now we can see that isBlue is true. So we turn the color green. Let's disable that breakpoint so we can kind of watch it in all its glory. Excellent. So now when we press the button, we have our view changing from blue to green and back again. Not bad. Not a very exciting app, but certainly not a bad effort for your first attempt with Xcode. Hopefully this has given you a feel for the different elements of Xcode. You're going to dive in more. There's so much power inside Xcode and inside the simulator. You'll find so much more as you keep developing. And you'll find so much more as they add more and more features. We have another really nice feature while we're running where you can go into the debug navigator here and pick this option here and view processes by thread, by queue, or this really interesting option, view UI hierarchy. Of course, this pauses all execution and shows you what your running interface looks like. This is great for debugging issues. Maybe a button doesn't appear on the screen. You can tap anywhere on the app and then turn it and see a 3D rendering, 3D layering of your view elements. So you can see we have our button here. If I tap on it, it's going to give me the whole path to this button in the user interface, including my constraints, some that I added and some that are calculated for me by the auto layout subsystem. This is hugely powerful, and we can go back and navigate all our different elements. I hope that's given you a little flavor of what Xcode's about and how to get started building iPhone apps. We'll give you a few resources to go off and check out from here. App development with Swift, available on the bookstore, is an amazing resource. I highly recommend checking it out, as is the Everyone Can Code Puzzles curriculum, which will use your iPad and Swift Playgrounds to get you started with Swift. This is an exciting place to be. You've started your journey as a programmer, and I'm really excited to see where you take it from here. Hope to see you on the session soon.